That's an 8.
An 8. All right. The topic we'll be discussing today, the design challenge we'll be taking upon ourselves, is to design a scenario in which you use an actual performance, such as singing, reading a short story, etc., to propel the story forward. This design challenge was added to our table by a previous guest, Nate B.
Hello, and welcome to Roll for Topic, a roundtable discussion about topics related to running role-playing games. I'm Chris Salzman.
And I'm Andy Rao.
And this week we are joined by our special guest, Alban. Alban, say hi.
Hi.
Hey, so thank you so much for coming on the podcast. So you had reached out to us, actually, about you started listening to the podcast, and you're like, oh, I think it'd be really fun to come on. Which is great. So that's maybe a shout out to everybody else who's listening. Like, if you really want to be on the podcast, like we're pretty easy to let you on. But yeah, so why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are and like what your history with gaming is?
I started all gaming essentially when I was like 8 or 9 years old in the early 90s with Warhammer. So it came definitely from the miniature side, and then just collected. I have piles of painted or unpainted minis in my parents' basement. Wish I bought stocks instead, but that's right. Hindsight. When it was like 2005 or so, I went to uni, and that's when I got into pen and paper RPGs. So I'd been kind of warmed up to it by playing Baldur's Gate and other RPGs on the PC, kind of as a teen, but really kind of got into first 3.5 and then a wealth of other games kind of over the years. So it's been not quite 20 years.
Wow, that's great.
I have a quick question. Do you have a favorite miniature?
I'm really happy with some of the paint jobs I did on some of my Dark Elves. I had an assassin and the bolt thrower captain.
Okay.
Kind of odd choices. I have some pretty nice old Chaos Champions that were in the mainstay of my old army, but the paint jobs on them is just terrible. When I was like 10 years old. They should never see the light of day again.
Did you play did you do like tournament play and stuff, or you just mostly playing with your friends?
I played in the local Games Workshop. Okay. So as a kid in the UK, it was really convenient. I was like 15 minutes walk away, so I had my little suitcase full of foam, and I just had my armies packed in. I would just walk up there, and then you kind of just got matched up.
That's super great. Yeah, so Andy and I are both in Michigan in the United States. There's a Games Workshop within a couple miles of me, or something like that. But my understanding is like over where you're at, like they're sort of everywhere. Is that accurate?
I'd say in the UK, they're everywhere. Okay. Even like small towns would have one. The rest of Europe, only major towns would have one. So here in Germany, where I live, there is one.
Yeah.
But I'd say that's more the exception than the rule.
So you mentioned a wealth of other games. And in my interaction with you just over email, you mentioned that you're currently running or you're planning to run an Ars Magica game. Is that the case?
Absolutely.
Is that a game you've played a lot of in the past, or is this new for you?
No, I've played it a few times. So I discovered it around 2010 or so. Like when I was finishing uni, we started a campaign and we had 1 sessions before the GM kind of quit. So he was not inspired. So Ars Magica is really front-loaded. I love the game, but it's really front-loading. Like creating your character, it's just another level compared to making, say, a D&D character. You're all playing mages, and the magic system is much more complicated, and the skill system is much more detailed. So you're looking at 4 hours maybe for your first character.
Does it speed up after if you make your second character? Does your second character only take 2 hours?
Yeah, it gets much faster. So once you know what you're doing, it goes a lot faster. So we did a game with my gaming group. So we started 2019, I think, and we ran for almost 2 years.
Wow.
Saga, where we were a bunch of European magicians in the 13th century who moved to the Baltic region. We first joined with Estonian pirates, where we were just raiding the Teutonic Order, the Swedes, whoever we could get our hands on. And that was a really cool campaign, but it came to an end because the power level just kind of skyrockets and gets to a point where to get a reasonable threat every in-game year just stops making sense. And the game ended, and about a year later, I decided to start my own campaign. So I just went for the very basic, so the Rhine Gorge is kind of the default setting. Conveniently, I live in the region, and what really pushed me over the fence was just paddling down the Rhine. It's just such fantastic scenery. You can see the wine being grown on one side, the big cliffs, the forests, the ruined castles. So it's really inspiring.
Oh my goodness, that's amazing. Have you done any like LARPing?
I haven't. Some of my friends have. Like, it's just never got the bother. I don't like camping. Is a
Yeah.
big thing.
That's a big part of it. Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
I am fascinated by Ars Magica. I've got a copy of it and a couple of source books on my gaming bookshelf, but I've never gathered the courage to run a game myself. I'm intimidated by its placement in a specific time and place in history. And I just feel like I don't know enough about European history at the time to run it well. And you're in Europe, so you're one step closer to the setting. But was it intimidating to you to run a historical game, or not so much?
For me, that was the appeal.
Mm.
I love history.
Okay.
So being in the region, like with my wife, we'd go on walks, like in the countryside, and I would just get scenario ideas just from walking. It's like, this valley is oddly mossy, even on the southern side. Like, yeah,
Oh.
it's really wet, and it's kind of weird. Why is there so much moss? Well, obviously, it's a local dryad that's angry at the local nobleman,
Obviously,
and it's
yes.
punishing things. So,
Yeah.
and that's how I got one of the scenarios. So being in it, like seeing the castles, I can just walk to town and see the big cathedral.
Mhm.
It just made it that much easier.
Hmm.
So for me, that was a drive practically to the game.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Mechanically and preparing, it was tough. I find one thing that's kind of lacking is kind of a good on-ramp.
Mm.
Like a lot of the people in the community have been in the community for 20 plus years,
Yeah.
and they know the game in and out. First time GMing for it was tricky. So I first did a couple of one-offs, one of them for my old group to kind of get a feeling for it. And I got a lot of support from the previous game master, kind of running ideas via him.
Oh, that's fantastic. Chris, have you ever been inspired to run a scenario or a game by traveling or hiking through an area?
No, but I'll sometimes take inspiration for like describing places, I think, based on, particular paths and stuff that I walk. I
Yeah.
used to play this little like storytelling game with my daughter. We would sort of like tell the story of the walk around the block every time. So there's like this old tree in someone's yard that has this hole in it that we call like the old owl tree, like stuff like that, like kind of just making up stories as we're going along. I really like that. I mean, again, Michigan doesn't have it has history, but it doesn't have, I guess I would say like as dramatic of a history as you're walking around, looking at stuff. Yeah, like most of the buildings and things that I see are related to the University of Michigan nearby. So they were built in the 60s, but the 1960s.
This summer, I spent some time in parts of the U.S. that we associate with the Wild West, and it was pretty hard not to my brain was going pretty fast, like thinking up Wild West scenarios, and maybe when I get back home I should start up a cowboy game of some sort. I haven't done that yet, but there is something about actually being in the physical place that your game is set that is it's something you can't really enjoy with like a straight fantasy game like Dungeons and Dragons. So I'm glad we have other games that are connected to more real places. So
yeah, John Corey, who's been on the podcast before and does Splatbook, has mentioned GM brain. That's sort of his thing. Like once you start GMing, you just like you can't lead a normal existence anymore. You're constantly going around. You're like, oh well, that would be a fun place. Set a scenario. Yeah, like oh my goodness, yeah, there's moss over there. Like how could that be, right? So you start thinking about everything in those terms. Yeah, and probably become a little bit insufferable to the people around you, but it does make for better games at the table.
Now the other thing is also, in a fantasy game, you have to come as a GM from scratch with everything, more or less. Here, I can just pick up like history. Wikipedia is full of information, and especially checking the German wiki and the English wiki, I can find out like who's the noble in the period, what did he do, who was accused of being of witchcraft, and all these things. And these are scenarios that just roll by themselves. Like you just have the history book, the chronology. There was a famous witch hunter in exactly the period of the 1220s, 1230s in the region. And he just started in the background just as a rumor. And I could just go blow by blow. Oh, yeah, he had these people burnt alive in, the city of Wetzlar.
Yeah.
And they kind of process in the campaign. And then he shows up and he's interrupted the magic harvest of the party. And that's it. We have a villain.
Oh, my goodness.
That's simple.
Yeah, you had to do almost no work. Like that scenario just writes itself, doesn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. Well, I'm going to have to convince my wife to let us move to Europe for a year or two, so specifically so I can prepare to run an Ars Magica.
Yeah, she's gonna go for that. Yes.
Yeah. So, guys, should we turn to the heart of our episode, which is taking on our design challenge? Let me refresh your memories and the memories of our beloved listeners. We've been challenged today to come up with an adventure idea based around an actual performance to propel the story or the scenario forward. Have either of you guys used a performance as integral part of a RPG adventure?
I'm trying to remember if I have. I don't think I have. The closest I've come to it is having. Well, I'll make two statements. I think the first one is like the closest I've come is having like a carnival, like a very specific setup of like here you can come and participate in this activity, this pre-planned
Mhm.
activity that's a little bit outside the norm. That's a little bit of a stretch. The other thing that like immediately jumped to mind thinking about this is like block text in adventures, block text, and then also especially like in like D&D modules, there's often like kind of a longer block text, or a couple pages of just like here's the backstory of what's going on. Like those sorts of things I find are really hard but also fun to sort of deliver at the table. It's like, look, you need to listen to me talk for a page, right? Like I need to get out all this information. It's got to be somewhat dramatic. I also got to make it not feel like I'm just reading something off of a page too, because it's got to feel a little bit more natural, right? So that's sort of where my mind went immediately. And I know my experiences with that, with making that come alive at the table, have made me hesitant to say write a short story and try to deliver that to everybody.
I once did a mini tarot reading for a Dark Heresy game.
Oh, nice.
Because in 40k, there's the Imperial Tarot, which is kind of from the very first stories, kind of built into the
Oh,
system,
Yeah.
kind of into the lore. I stacked the deck. I knew which cards I wanted to be on
Yes.
top,
Yeah.
so I kind of fudged it, faked shuffling, etc., and then magically, poof, the three cards that I wanted to be on top.
Yeah.
Hopefully, the players didn't see it. If they did, they didn't say it.
Yes.
And then, based on that, kind of each of the characters, kind of based on like a few sessions of play, I'd figured out what the kind of tarot archetype they
Mm.
corresponded to were. And then each one had this card, and it became kind of their in system. The tarot cards are minorly psychically active, so it became kind of their pass cards for when they would get deliveries from the Inquisitor.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Like, so as you mentioned that, I mean, it's so something that strikes me is right. So this, I think this design challenge sort of it's asking you as a GM to come up with something that like you're requiring your players to sort of sit through to get to the end of it, right? Like, like you're doing a tarot reading, like they can't stop you. Like this has to happen, right? Whereas like a number of other things can happen in a campaign where they could be like, well, we're actually not going to fight that guy, or like we're going to do something that's going to totally surprise you, right? But like this is a planned activity, almost like within your planned activity of playing a game. So I guess I'm curious, when you were doing the tarot reading, did you actually like flip over? Did you have like a deck with you too? Like that you actually
Yep.
flip over the
So
cards? Nice.
in France, the tarot deck is used as kind of almost as commonly as rummy deck, for
Oh, okay.
example. So
Yeah.
most people will have it at home. So I've had it. There's kind of a French playing card
Okay.
game which uses the same deck. So it's pretty easy. I just have those cards. So it was kind of not a big challenge. It's not like I had to order a 50 euro deck from the
Yeah.
internet or something.
Now, I had a different thought when we rolled this topic. My mind went to the PCs participating in a
Mm.
performance as part of the adventure. I'm curious if that has ever been an element in either of your games.
Mhm.
I am aware in my own gaming history, I have not run it, but I'm pretty sure there's a Pathfinder adventure or adventure path in which the players are the actors in a play.
Hmm.
And I think at least some of that play is printed out in the adventure for the players to read, dramatically read and perform in some
Oh,
sense.
that's
I haven't
fun.
done it, and since I haven't really read it, I can't speak too much. I know there are one or two Call of Cthulhu adventures that the play The King in Yellow appears in, and
Mm.
I'm pretty sure at least one of them involves some sort of participation by the players. One of the challenges with having a performance, and both of you were kind of alluding to this, one of the challenges of having a performance is, what if attending a play is an important part of the plot? How do you, the GM, communicate that experience without just reading a summary of what happens in the play? All right, you
Mhm.
sat there for 3 hours and here's a quick summary of what happened. Is there a better way to evoke the experience of a performance without handing everybody a 3-hour script for the play?
Just like playing a tabletop game, you have to have buy-in from people to want to play that. I think you have to have some amount of buy-in for either the party listening to you do this or to participate in it. And I think that's okay. I don't know if there is going to be a better system to do it other than asking them to go memorize their lines before before they come to the next session.
I'm just thinking kind of different direction, but one thing I tried once was non-linear kind of chronology. So you know how Pulp Fiction, the
Yeah.
movie is just cut apart. I tried to do that once
Ooh.
for a session of L5R. So I started a session with them in jail being interrogated by the Imperial Magistrate. And I had them sometimes narrate how they got out of things.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it completely fell apart because
Yeah.
the opening fight, they were supposed to kill the bad guy, who was also a noble, but they failed. They got beaten up by really bad luck. So I had to justify kind of how this could come back to them on the fly. They loved it because I was
Yeah.
completely out of my depth. My prep went right out the window.
Yeah.
So then they were captured and they were in the dungeon of the bad guy and they had to escape. And then they had to narrate in character and kind of would switch between them explaining to the magistrate and them acting it kind of within the game, kind of doing the roles. So it's kind of weird mishmash of like the two storylines at the same time.
Oh, that's super fun.
That is fascinating.
Yeah.
That makes me think. So, in a minute, maybe we can try to narrow this down into something concrete that we can come up with. But so I've run a couple games of the Alien RPG by Free League, and last night was I ran a session of it, and it was a different experience in that you're more explicitly, we were playing in the mode of that game that is explicitly trying to recreate the experience of like an alien movie, and several of the players leaned quite heavily into that and were making decisions not because they made necessarily the most sense, but because that's the sort of decisions you would expect to see people in a movie making. And it shifted the tone of the experience a little bit from just being a typical role-playing game, and it was something a little bit closer to actually performing a movie or performing a story. And it was a subtle change, but it felt pretty big to me as the GM in the moment. That, like, interesting, we're not exactly role-playing anymore, we're sort of improvising a movie here. So I don't know, have you guys had that experience or anything like that?
So I played in one of your Alien one shots, and I do remember making decisions that was trying to make more cinematic than like what I'd want. Like metagame, right? I knew this was all a terrible idea. We should just get to the ship and get out. But
Don't lean in and put your face right next to the alien.
Right? Yeah. So there's some of that sort of stuff. But yeah, and I think there's a lot of fun that can be had there. Again, you have to buy into the idea that like you are telling a story, like a cinematic story, which I disagree with. I think there's a lot of people that sort of they run their games as a default as cinematic, like there's like an actual movie camera kind of following them around, and I don't think that's necessarily the right way to run all games. But yeah, but I mean, I think with Alien in particular, I think you do have to, if you want to evoke that feeling, you need to make the bad decisions, the bad decisions that you would.
Okay, well, hey, why don't we try and take this topic and narrow it down to something concrete that we can produce. So we've got to create a scenario based around a performance. So why don't we decide, is this going to be a performance that the players take part in, or is the performance something that you, the GM, are doing and portraying to the characters?
I think player involvement is definitely kind of preferable. Just keep people involved. Somehow have them kind of, as the players, use their player characters within the play, and then possibly make some kind of skill rolls to kind of push the story forward. So whichever it could be, like they go to fairyland and the party has to somehow put on a show to impress or show that they're playing into the story of the Forest King.
Yeah.
And then, for example, they have to make a charm roll, they have to make some kind of melee roll to show that, there's a big fight, etc. And have kind of this conscious kind of meta thinking, but kind of this deliberate kind of two-level, you're playing somebody who's playing someone. And then just if that can be mechanized in some way, that way the players don't have to tell the entire speech. Like you don't have to spend a 3-hour song for the king, but just make a charm roll. And based on that, it's either a good song or a bad song.
Yeah, so you mentioned that. I'd kind of forgotten. I ran a one shot where the party was a traveling performance troupe, which that was a really fun just conceit for how people got together. Right, it's like, well, you're in a traveling group together, but they did have to do a performance for a local local nobility And so that was like the one time in D&D that I've gotten people to like roll performance checks and like, you know, like,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
some of those things where it's just, you know, you don't really dig those out too often. But it was really fun because it was open ended. I was just like, you have to impress this guy. I think I ended up just using like it's like a clock, like a Blades in the Dark style clock, which is like you got to get 6 impression points on this guy, or like, right, or he's going to behead you, whatever. Yeah, but I mean, offering it back to them, like you were saying, of like, here's the result you're going for as a group. Like, you tell me sort of how you're going to get there, or like, yeah, let's, you know, set yourself up well to make this roll, but you're still going to make it a roll, and like, we're not exactly going to do the performance part.
How did you, or how do you, make the player challenge of creating a cool performance? Obviously, it's going to boil down to a roll, a performance check. How do you make it more interesting than that for the players? If they know that at the end of all of this, they're just going to roll a d20 and add their performance skill.
Maybe you don't have a check. You're like, maybe you don't have a roll at the end of it. I'm trying to think like, okay, so is it Hamlet, the Shakespeare play that has the play within the play? Like Hamlet.
No, I think it's Midsummer Night's Dream.
Okay. There might be, knowing Shakespeare, it's probably a couple of them. But yeah, I think the one I'm thinking about, it's definitely a tragedy. And it's like, it's very much, the play is put on to sort of goad the king into, or goad the queen, goad some nobility into sort of like, yeah, realizing that it's all about them. I'd like that as the setup for something where it's like, there isn't necessarily a mechanic thing. It's very much a storytelling beat. If there's a way to do that.
Exalted Stunting.
Tell us more about that.
Yeah.
In the role-playing game, Exalted, at least in second ed, if you narrate well or give like good description to the action, not just I hit the orc with my axe, but you explain kind of detail a bit, you would get like bonuses to your roll.
Oh.
So maybe based on the quality of the player's kind of improv thingy, you might give kind of, if it's D&D, like advantage or disadvantage or whatever else.
Ooh.
But that puts a lot of soft skill versus hard skill, which might be unfair on some people who might not feel comfortable kind of dropping a haiku.
Yeah. Yes. An improvised haiku. Maybe let's take a second and maybe decide on like what kind of performance we're going to go for. None of us has mentioned singing, so I'm going to guess that we're not going to do a singing performance in this. Although I guess, Andy, you let me know. I guess this would be your area.
It's funny. Recently, I've joined for the first time in many years a singing group, and we'll be performing Handel's Messiah over Christmas. And so I've been having these regular practices with the group. And I mean, there's a lot that goes into performing a piece of music. A simple skill roll, as with a play or anything else, a simple skill roll or even 1 or 2 skill rolls doesn't quite capture the amount of effort and coordination that goes into a really effective performance of a piece. I'm no music expert here, but I'm game for incorporating music into this in some way. We have all been, I think, it's like kind of circling around the idea of a play, because that I suspect we feel that connection that a play has to the act of role playing to some extent. But so are the PCs in a situation? I kind of liked the Alban's Impress the King of Fairyland idea. Can we play with that?
Yeah, I mean, like, what if the setup is such that you can't fight your way out, right? Like you're being asked or required in some way to put on this performance, right? And then we can talk about like exactly what you want to get out of that in a second. But so is Fairyland Magical Woods style Fairyland, or do we want to tweak the setting at all?
I think Magical Woods, for example, works. And essentially, the party has to reenact kind of a classical fairy tale.
Yeah. Ooh.
So the party could be, it doesn't matter if it's Jason and the Argonauts or if it's something from the Round Table.
Yeah.
They have to repeat a known story, possibly because the fairy king thinks he is one of the kings from that story. So if it's Jason and the Minotaur, Theseus and the Minotaur? Theseus and the Minotaur. His Theseus's father is being played by the fairy king, and the only way to get out is to fulfill the story, come back with the black sails, then the fairy king will have to throw himself off the cliff, and then the party wins.
Oh, that's perfect.
That's so good.
So they have to make a seduction roll to convince the local princess to help them. They have a melee challenge, beating up the Minotaur, and maybe something else, depending on the number of party members you have. But they have to kind of follow the beats of the original story, and once they fulfill the story, then they get the prize.
As I'm picturing it, right, like I'm picturing the setting as like you have a bunch of fairy folk sitting on mushrooms, right, like in this amphitheater in the woods somewhere. Like maybe the amphitheater itself is like the rib cage from like a giant deer that's died in the woods or something like that, right? Like, so it's very atmospheric like that. And so you have the fairy king sitting up, like, yeah, up on the largest mushroom, watching this play go through, and like getting more and more hyped up and amped up as it's like, yeah, progressing progressing through. Like, so then what are the players specifically doing for this? I think to work, you need to ask them to do some sort of actual performance, I think, right? So I think there is the role, but I think for this to be like the maximum amount of fun, I think you need to also ask them to deliver some lines, or, you know, actually stand up and act something out a bit.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I think certain type of player would really resonate with that. Other people would probably wince, and
Yes, it's very cringe, as the kids say, but
the part that interests me is the planning out of the beats. Like, so maybe the PCs would, if they know the legend that they're trying to recreate, the PCs would know the basic turns and course of the story that they need to reproduce. But I'm interested in the ability of a performance to subvert or to change the message of a piece. I probably won't be able to articulate this very well, but the way that you can use the performance of one thing to deliver a specific message to the viewer is interesting to me. So I wonder if the players might, if their success might rest on both, can you capably perform the elements of this story, and can you do so in a way that delivers the message that you want to deliver to the king or to the
mm-hmm.
audience, if
Yeah.
there's a difference between those two things.
What if we define like a couple of potential outcomes? You have the fairy king, and maybe the fairy king, like, so maybe there's like the one hand, like, you could, your goal is to like infuriate the fairy king, or it could be to convince him to do something else, or it could be like to humble him, right? Like, you have sort of these other options, like all these options in front of the players. And then from there, then they can decide, like, okay, should we tell a story that is like, it's very clearly to him, about him, so he like can see himself in that. You know, you tell a different story, you know, about his queen, right? Like, you know, like, you kind of leave it maybe open to the players themselves how to figure that out, like what kind of performance they want to put on for the effect that they want to get. Does that make sense, or do you think that is that too open-ended to give to a party?
It depends on the players. I would say that's the
Yeah.
big difference. Um, for some, they'll love it. The more open it is, the
Hmm.
more they'll have space to tell whatever.
Yeah.
Some people might find it paralyzing.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Let's then, for this sake of this, let's pretend like this is the party that you're running this for needs those choices taken away from them. So let's give them like one choice on this.
Yeah, then I would definitely say kind of name the Fairy King after a main character from the story that
Hmm.
they're meant to play for him. So it doesn't matter if it's the Nibelungen lead. So then he'll be the king who has set fire to his hall at the end of the story,
Hmm.
and then they have to reenact the slaying of the dragon at Siegfried or something. But they need to be told which story they have to play.
Yeah.
Then, of course, as players, they might be able to get some refreshers. Kind of, they might know it, they might not know the story so well.
Hmm.
Then you might give them a bit of help,
Hmm.
and then kind of they have to figure out, you tell them kind of one beat per player, I would say,
Hmm.
Yeah.
and then kind of that would kind of pace things roughly.
Would you consider giving this to the players as sort of homework to do in between sessions?
Hmm.
Instead of saying at the table, okay, everyone put together this performance, would you come in 2 weeks, come with your plan for how you're going to perform this? Or is
Oh,
that
that's
asking
interesting.
too much of players?
I'd love that.
Yeah. I think I would, as a player, I think I would hate that. As a GM, I would love it. Right? Like, okay, like, yeah, in 2 weeks, like, I will be playing the, you know, the fairy king. Like, you're gonna walk in and give me this performance. Yeah, I mean, so Andy, what would you think? Like, so if you did give them the homework to go do it, like, what would you expect them to come back with?
So I would expect them to have reviewed the story or the legend that they need to retell. And then I like giving them the editorial authority to choose which parts of the story they're going to focus their performance on. Because choosing what scenes, you know, in any legend that you're going to spend time on and which you're going to gloss over, I think can dramatically shift the tone of the story.
Hmm.
So I think that would tell me a lot about what the players want to accomplish. And I think it's an opportunity for the players to be pretty clever if they want.
Mm-hmm.
So I would want them to come back with, oh yeah, what story beats are we going to do? Who is going to kind of be the pivotal PC for each of these story beats, and maybe let them make the case of whatever game system we're using, what are the mechanics you're going to use to determine your success with this. So
Mm-hmm.
instead of having 10 different performance checks, tell me why you're going to use your make a strength check and a perception roll or something. Just be creative with the mechanics, and maybe think beyond even just the skill system, but just about the game system as a whole.
Hmm.
What would be a fun way to determine the results of this? And again, please, I'm just monologuing here, so step in if someone interrupt me if I'm getting tedious. But as each scene goes on, you sort of keep a tally of. I kind of like the. There are some older RPGs that had. I'm thinking of a parody RPG called Hackmaster, but I think there were some non-parody games that did this as well, where things like alignment were something you you tracked a character's alignment by tracking it around like basically a grid. I'm not sure if this is making sense, but you could calculate the drift of a character's alignment on some sort of a chart or a grid. And I kind of like the idea of the players and the GM working together to come up with what is the king thinking about this performance chart, So it's
Oh,
not just a matter of like build up 10 successful performance checks and the king does what you want, but it's more a matter of each time you're rolling the dice, you're pushing the king in a particular direction on kind of a chart. And you're trying to get him into the place on that chart that has the results you want. You want him maybe to be angry, but you also maybe want him to feel guilt.
yeah.
Uh, am I making any sense? I'm going to stop
No.
talking and let you guys.
No, it makes a lot of sense. The
Yeah.
thing is, how many axes do you track?
Right. Yeah.
Because you'd have
Yeah,
that's kind of the thing. Because spectra of human emotion, you'd have a very, very big and complicated multidimensional.
yes.
Yeah.
But if you say, for example, here are four things,
Mhm.
four basic emotions, and you want to fill, and you have to fill two of those bars,
Mhm.
and the king will kind of be suitably impressed.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter which one. You can make him sad, happy, uh, full of love, or full of rage. Doesn't matter. But you have to fill him with something.
Mm-hmm. I like that a lot. Yeah, because then I think as you as a GM need to be able to sort of roll with sort of what ends up happening from that performance a bit too. That's totally fine, right? Like, so if you get to the end of that and the king like never wants you to leave because he loves you so much, like that's a problem. If the king wants to kill you so you can never leave, like that's a problem, right? Like, so there's all sorts of ways that could end up. I mean, the worst possible outcome would be like the king gets so bored that he leaves the performance. But even that you could probably work with
Yeah.
too. Okay, so I like that a lot. So Andy, you're proposing some sort of grid or sliders or whatever, right? Like that you're sort of filling up as you're going through this, but you're also proposing that you kind of send off the players to come up with what they want to do as homework, which I like that too. I think the GM needs to set like here's what the fairy tale is, right? Like here's the thing that you're gonna do, and then come back either next session or come back after I've like used the bathroom and gotten a snack, right? Like whatever that time frame is, like it's your decision, and if the GM wants to sit in and listen to it, they can they can from there. So then is the performance, it's a play, would you reward extra bonus points if someone's like, okay, I'm going to actually take a run at writing a haiku for my portion of it, or or pull out a guitar or something like that and play.
If someone did a good job, absolutely. I would
Yeah.
say don't even roll.
Yeah.
You just dropped some massive haiku. Yeah, just go for it. You don't need to roll. That was amazing.
Yeah.
If you don't trust yourself, if you just kind of paralyzed, then just make me, charisma plus poetry roll.
Oh, I like that. Give them a very obvious mechanical advantage for engaging in the performance aspect of it, but then also give someone an out if they're like, I don't want to improvise right now.
I can't imagine not rolling with it if a player, pulled out a guitar at the table and started
Yes.
playing. I mean, you just have to reward that level of engagement.
Yes. You have to reward it and also tell them this is the one time this is happening. Yeah. It's good. All right. Well, I think we should wrap it up around here. Do you have any sort of final thoughts on this? Any like parting shots or like a totally different direction you take it before we say goodbye?
I'd say it depends on going back to it depends on the party. Some of the
Yeah.
groups I've been in, there was really active kind of between sessions. We had an IRC chat,
Okay.
and then there was lots of stuff going on there. Some groups, that's it. You see them once a week, and there's no contact or next no contact in between, and that's
Hmm.
that. So prep time really will depend on the group. So I guess this is something you as a GM need to have a feeling for.
Hmm.
It feels like something you might want to pitch as sort of a special or optional game session almost. Like, hey,
Hmm.
we're going to do something kind of cool and interesting for this next session. If this is not something you want to do, just skip it and we'll see you in 2 weeks or whatever.
Yeah.
To the extent there is any sort of real life performance going on by the players, if they're going to be pulling out their guitars or pulling out haiku, I think, it probably would pay off to make the actual physical environment you're all in really conducive to that. So make it a party, make
Hmm.
it, my inclination would be to make this a special event and then kind of put in some extra work to making it more of a party
Hmm.
performance than a regular game night.
Yeah. Your D&D night has become an open mic night.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, that's good. All right. Well, this is a good conversation. I don't know if we came up with like here's the exact scenario to run, but I think there's a lot of like really interesting thoughts in there. Like I kind of want to maybe start a campaign with this is what I'm thinking about. Like that could be a really fun way to kick things off is, yeah, you have been transported to the fairy, the fairy woods and need to impress this fairy king. I mean, that could really set the tone for the rest of the campaign in a fun
Yeah.
way. But Andy, do you have another thought?
Yeah, I just had one stray thought.
Okay.
It
Yeah.
was something I was talking to my teenager about a while ago. There is a story in the Old Testament that illustrates like the power of a performance to communicate something that like a more direct spoken conversation wouldn't. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with the story of David and Bathsheba.
Hmm.
He's a king who he wanted the wife of one of his soldiers, so he had the soldier killed basically, and then he took the wife. And then
Hmm.
a prophet comes to him, and instead of saying prophet comes to kind of to convict him or to render judgment on him, but instead of saying, "Look what you did, you're a bad person, and this is going to be the punishment," he recites it. He tells a story. He tells a parable. It's a parable about a rich person stealing something from a poor person, and it's extremely obvious what the parallels are,
Yes.
but the way it plays out is the king is like, well, this is outrageous, that person should be killed, and then the prophet drops the line of like, well, you're the person. And
Yeah.
you couldn't get that dramatic delivery if you were just telling somebody, or to put it in our fantasy context, if you want something from that fairy king, how much more powerful is it to deliver your request or something through the performance than just to say, "Oh king,
Hmm.
please give us this," right?
Yeah.
We haven't talked too much about like why the players are performing for the king. Maybe that's something you could involve them in. What do you want from the king, and why is your performance gonna how are you gonna make your performance hit 10 times harder than just submitting your request to him in writing?
And you have to work into the story to propel the campaign, the saga forward. So what do they need? I don't know. Maybe the fairy king has a magic sword. Maybe he knows the weakness of the dragon they
Hmm.
want to slay. That will be saga to saga, but a fairy king will always have something shiny.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
That's good.
Okay, well, Chris, will you wrap us up here?
Yeah. Well, this has been really great. Alban, thank you so much for coming on. Yeah, this was super fun and a really good conversation. And loved hearing a little bit about your gaming history and what you're up to. Well, Roll for Topic is part of the Roll for It Media podcasting network. Our sister podcast is the Splat Book with John Corey and Kyle Latino. They're two lovely people. The last episode that I listened to with them, let's see, Kyle was not on that week. He was out, but they had Tim Saucer on to talk about how to run games for kids. It was a really good
Oh,
conversation
wonderful.
and topic. Yeah, I know that's something that Andy and I have like sort of talked about a little bit, and my kids are starting to get to the age where I can actually think about that. Alban, I think you got a couple years before
A lot
before
of
that'll
them.
be a concern. But
Yeah.
yeah, so it was really good. Yeah, definitely go check them out at thesplatbook.com. Yeah, and I again thank you, Alban, for coming on. I've been Chris Salzman.
I've been Andy Rao.
Alban, you want to say your name? Say
Oh, I've also been Alban.
yeah. Cool. All right. Well, thank you. All right. Well, remember, if your players are having fun, you're a great GM.